Let's get philosophical. Critical Reflections on Conspiracy Theory. Authored by Kurtis Hagen. The following is a modified portion of an article entitled "Do Conspiracies Tend to Fail? Philosophical Reflections on a Poorly Supported Academic Meme," which was published in the journal Episteme in 2022 by Kurtis Hagen. This is part 2 of a 2-part series, this part focusing on an article by David Grimes called "On the Viability of Conspiratorial Beliefs."
Do Conspiracies Tend to Fail? Part 2, on the viability of Grimes's mathematical model. Many people claim that conspiracies tend to fail, and that this is a reason to dismiss conspiracy theories, especially large ones. In part 1 of this 2-part series, we observed that judging the degree to which conspiracies tend to fail is difficult, due to the inherent problem of determining how many conspiracies have not been revealed. In addition, we noted that we have reason to suspect that certain kinds of conspiracies, such as covert operations, do not tend to fail in the sense of becoming known. We also observed that 3 of the 4 sources recently cited in the social science literature ostensibly supporting the notion that conspiracies tend to fail provided minimal support for that claim, at best. The last of the 4 sources, an article called "On the Viability of Conspiratorial Beliefs," by David Grimes, was the only one of the 4 that actually attempted to provide a substantial argument supporting the notion that conspiracies tend to fail, at least if that claim is assumed to refer to fairly large conspiracies. Indeed, Grimes offers what is probably the best, that is, the most seemingly authoritative case for the claim that conspiracies will tend to fail in a way that is relevant to our assessment of conspiracy theories. Grimes purports to have provided what he describes as a simple mathematical demonstration of the untenability of certain conspiracy theories. I argue that Grimes's account is unconvincing. It is plagued by a host of serious flaws. I begin with a description of Grimes's strategy. Grimes's model is built on the assumptions that conspirators are generally dedicated to the concealment of the conspiracy and that the conspiracy would be exposed by any leak from an insider. He uses the following 3 exposed conspiracies to estimate the probability, over time, of such exposure, relative to the size of the conspiracy: the NSA's PRISM surveillance program, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and the FBI forensic scandal, each of which will be described very briefly below. Grimes uses his results to estimate the likelihood of certain specific conspiracy theories as well as to justify the general claim that large conspiracies are likely to quickly fail, and so mature theories that imply large conspiracies are untenable. Grimes claims to have developed, quote, "a simple mathematical model for conspiracies involving multiple actors with time, which yields failure probability for any given conspiracy," unquote. He uses this to argue that, in his words,
large conspiracies, greater than or equal to 1,000 agents, quickly become untenable and prone to failure.
Grimes explicitly acknowledges that historical examples of exposed conspiracies do exist. Indeed, it is the 3 above-mentioned known scandals that provide a basis for his model's parameters. He attempts to use his model to estimate the likelihood of some commonly held conspiratorial beliefs, and to thereby demonstrate that they are highly unlikely. Specifically, he uses his model to evaluate the idea that the moon landings were faked, that climate change is a hoax, that vaccination is dangerous, and that a cure for cancer is being suppressed by vested interests. He concludes,
simulations of these claims predict that intrinsic failure would be imminent even with the most generous estimates for the secret-keeping ability of active participants.
Grimes's article garnered significant attention. It is described in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy as follows.
Grimes, 2016, has conducted simulations showing that large conspiracies with 1,000 agents or more are unlikely to succeed due to problems with maintaining secrecy.
In addition, Grimes's study was covered favorably in the press. An article in Mother Jones magazine suggests that Grimes succeeded in showing certain conspiracy theories to be, quote, really dumb, unquote. BBC likewise covered the study uncritically, as did PBS and The Washington Post, as well as Live Science, Science Daily, and Wired. The Wired article prominently proclaims that
the equation shows most conspiracy theories would have unraveled by now.
However, Grimes did not even claim to do that, as he only addressed purported conspiracies that are large and have been around for some time. Intuitively, it seems that some versions of prominent conspiracy theories posit conspiracies so large and ambitious that it seems very likely that they, if true, would have been exposed. Grimes aims to provide a, quote, clear rationale for clarifying the outlandish from the reasonable, unquote. He develops a model for the likelihood of exposure of a conspiracy based on real conspiracies that have been exposed, and as mentioned above, he applies his model to conspiracy theories involving the moon landing, climate change, cancer cures, and vaccines. However, in reality, not all versions of such theories imply the same scope of conspirators or have the same susceptibility to exposure. And though Grimes refers to commonly held conspiratorial beliefs, it is not clear that the versions that are genuinely commonly held really have the characteristics that make them susceptible to the kind of failure Grimes focuses on. In any case, if Grimes's method is valid, it should work for all conspiracy theories that have numbers in the right ranges. And further, Grimes seems to assume that, for example, all conspiracy theories alleging some sort of cover-up of vaccination harms would have to be large enough in a relevant way to be essentially ruled out as too likely to have already been exposed. If he has not shown that, the door remains open to the possibility that there are versions of these types of conspiracies that might not be reasonably expected to have failed. Grimes, clearly, does not want that. The whole point of his project is to shut that door. This is fairly clear from the article itself, but it is unambiguously clear from Grimes's later comments about the article, and it is corroborated by the way the article has been read by journalists seemingly eager to promote Grimes's findings. And this is, in any case, the interesting question. Has he shown that we may safely dismiss conspiracy theories of the general types that he describes? I argue that he has not. General problems with Grimes's analysis. Grimes's argument has serious flaws. For one, as discussed above, although we know of some conspiracies that were exposed, we don't know how many were not exposed. Grimes seems to think that we can take a few cases that were exposed and use those to judge how long it takes for exposure. However, he is working from a potentially biased sample. We also need to know how many real conspiracies have never been discovered or proven. But, of course, we cannot know that. While it might make some sense to make approximations based on the ranges we find in existing cases, Grimes is dealing with a very small sample, 3 revealed conspiracies, which differ considerably from each other. They are as follows: 1. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, in which African American men with syphilis were studied without being significantly treated, while the fact that they had syphilis was concealed from them. 2. The FBI forensic scandal, which involved the conviction of many people, based, at least in part, on misleading testimony in bogus forensics, revealed by Frederick Whitehurst. And 3. The NSA PRISM project, involving the U.S. National Security Agency's massive data collection, which was brought to light by Edward Snowden. These 3 examples do not even seem to be of the same type, such that modeling for that type might be thought appropriate. 1. The Tuskegee experiment was completely different from the other 2, particularly in involving the publicly available documentation of what was going on, published in scientific journals. This made what was going on undeniable once sufficient light was shined upon it. In this important respect, it does not resemble most purported conspiracies. 2. The FBI scandal, compared to the other 2 examples, seems somewhat pedestrian, involving ongoing corrupt practices at a relatively low level, rather than a particular elaborate plot run from on high. In this way, it also differs from many conspiracy theories. And, while I don't mean to minimize the severity of the retaliation suffered by Whitehurst for his revelation of the fraud that was occurring, it is hardly comparable to Edward Snowden's case. 3. Snowden's revelations about the NSA were truly extraordinary, requiring great sacrifices and even greater risks on the part of Snowden to reveal them. These revelations also required incredibly meticulous execution. So, it is hard to see how Snowden's case can be used to determine what should be expected to happen. Grimes's model is problematic. Grimes' model is designed to represent the likelihood of a conspiracy failing from an internal exposure. Accordingly, the conspiracies that Grimes chose for his model, which occurred within the NSA, NHS, and FBI, were exposed by people who were in those institutions. So, the conspiracies were exposed by insiders, in a sense, even if they were not conspirators. It is perhaps fair to suggest that people within such institutions may be more likely than outsiders to become aware of conspiracies going on within those institutions. Still, the number of individual employees that are actually positioned to become aware of a conspiracy within an institution is likely to vary widely, depending both on the nature of the institution and the nature of the conspiracy. Presumably, fewer people were in a position to know or find out about the scope of NSA spying than were in a position to know or find out about the Tuskegee experiment, about which scientific articles were being published. And this scope of potential access has little if anything to do with the size of the institution as a whole. And yet Grimes's model is based on the size of these large institutions, not the size of the actual conspiracy, nor the number of people with a heightened potential of finding out. One can hardly blame Grimes for not basing his calculations on the latter category, even though it is much more relevant than the size of the whole institution. For it seems hopelessly vague and immeasurable. But that just means that the kind of study that he wants to do may not be feasible. Grimes's estimates are not reasonable. When he evaluates commonly held conspiratorial beliefs, he is not sufficiently generous regarding the size of the conspiracy they entail. As M. Dentith explains,
a conspiracy can look big, yet only a small number of people involved in it might know its full extent or aim. Some members of the conspiracy will be lackeys, goons, or even unwitting conspirators. Not everyone in the NSA need necessarily know that the data they are collecting and processing has been illegally obtained, and FBI agents who are using forensic evidence to secure convictions may not have been informed by senior personnel that the kind of evidence they were relying upon was of dubious merit. It is even possible to be involved in a conspiracy without realizing you are conspiring.
Ignoring all such nuances, Grimes simplistically assumes that the appropriate number of conspirators to assign to the moon landing hoax conspiracy theory, for example, is the peak NASA employment in 1965, that is, 411,000 people. BBC dutifully reports this without question, under the title, Math Study Shows Conspiracies Prone to Unraveling. Grimes offers no good reason to think that all NASA employees would be in on it, or aware that it was a hoax. Indeed, if such a conspiracy had been attempted, it may have been managed so as to keep those in the know as limited as possible. If the right people were involved, there may have been some creative way to do this by leveraging NASA's institutional structure. It is not intuitively clear why the number of people truly in a position to leak the truth would have been greater than, say, a few hundred. So, it seems quite possible that Grimes's estimate is off by 3 orders of magnitude. Grimes has done nothing to show that such an intuitive estimation is wrong. Regarding conspiracies involving climate change, vaccine science, and suppressed cancer cures, Grimes considers the size of the conspiracy to be the size of the relevant scientific community. Consider the justification that Grimes offers for the idea that a scientific conspiracy would have to be vast. He writes,
Even if a small devious cohort of rogue scientists falsified data for climate change or attempted to cover up vaccine information, examination by other scientists would fatally undermine the nascent conspiracy. To circumvent this, the vast majority of scientists in a field would have to mutually conspire. A circumstance the model predicts is exceptionally unlikely to be viable.
Grimes seems to be suggesting that if there were a conspiracy involving scientific fraud, even if it was perpetrated by only a small number of scientists, it would have been exposed by other scientists, unless they too became party to the conspiracy, and at that point the theory becomes implausible. But it is far from clear that this picture is accurate. If, for example, a group of scientists at Merck stumble upon a cure to cancer, and management decides to suppress it, why would everyone at Merck have to know about that, or be in a position to discover it? Yet Grimes seems to assume that even everyone at Novartis, Pfizer, Roche, Sanofi, Johnson & Johnson, GlaxoSmithKline, and AstraZeneca would also be in a position to blow the whistle. Do theories about suppressed cancer cures necessarily posit or imply this? It is not clear that they do. Grimes seems to overestimate the relevant scrutiny that exists and ignores the possible influence of pervasive bias. If a small group of scientists fudge some numbers, there may well be no indications of that fudging that peer reviewers, or other non-involved scientists, would easily be able to detect. And if the peer reviewers and other fellow scientists found the results both pleasing and well within their expectations, fitting the current narrative, they may not be particularly motivated to scrutinize the results. It might be argued that a fraudulent study or two would not be sufficient to change the discourse on a topic like vaccine safety or climate change. But that is not entirely clear either, at least not in every case. For example, in an evaluation of the science regarding the relationship between vaccination and pervasive developmental disorder, which includes autism, the number of studies that the Institute of Medicine relied upon was quite small. Starting with 32 somewhat relevant studies, they whittled that down to only 4 studies that they judged might help with a study of the vaccine schedule. They found that the scientific evidence, quote, does not suggest a causal association, unquote, between autism and the overall vaccination schedule, but they described this as being based on evidence that is, quote, limited both in quantity and in quality, unquote. So, if just a couple experiments were carefully manipulated, and those specific individual frauds were not discovered, that may plausibly have a significant influence on the ongoing consensus, especially if the fraud was convenient to powerful interests. Regarding the claim that climate change is a hoax, there are a range of positions that might fall into that category. However, for many who promote these conspiracy theories, hoax may be hyperbole. Let's try to imagine one possible version of this. Suppose a few people at the top of organizations with ample financial resources had interests in generating concern about carbon emissions, and so created an incentive structure that subtly encouraged scientific thought leaders to support an overly pessimistic view of the climate hazard, which in turn led to a consensus that was not fully rational, perhaps by being based on biased, though not fraudulent, studies. How many people would be in a position to expose this situation? It is not even clear exactly how this situation could be convincingly revealed, even if it were true. And, although many climate change conspiracy theories are explicitly more radically conspiratorial than this, it is not clear that they really need to deviate very far from this to preserve their central thesis. For Grimes's argument to be genuinely informative, to do more than show that some versions of such theories overstate their case, it would have to be applicable to theories resembling this. But it is not at all clear that it is. Grimes's analysis assumes that if a conspiracy theory were true, it could easily be shown to be true by any random scientist who uncovered fraud. But that doesn't seem to be correct. Even if some element of actual fraud was involved and was discovered, that would probably not suffice to invalidate the consensus about climate change, nor would it show that the central thesis of the conspiracy theory was true. The deeper conspiracy would not have thereby been revealed. For many potential cases, Grimes's assumptions about what it takes to reveal a conspiracy do not hold. Incidentally, largely independent conspiracies of different kinds could be loosely held together thematically by a confluence of interests or ideology, petty science fraud on one level, and more subtle influence on incentive structures, or propaganda campaigns, on another level. One level could not rat out the other if they did not actually conspire together. But is this a plausible model for how the world really works? Given that petty scientific fraud occurs, and that organizations do intentionally influence incentive structures, the question of whether the world is like this is really one of degree, and thus is a very difficult empirical question. In general, contrary to Grimes's central assumption, the size of an institution in which a conspiracy is alleged to mainly occur does not even roughly indicate the size of the conspiracy itself, nor the circle of people with knowledge of it. In this regard, it may be useful to consider that institutions are institutions within institutions, and so one needs some substantial reason for focusing on a particular institutional scope. For example, NASA is an institution within the US government. Grimes's estimates for the size of a moon landing hoax conspiracy would have been silly if he had determined its size based on the size of the entire federal government. Grimes's estimates are less silly, but still not appropriately nuanced. Grimes's critical assumption is unsafe. Leaks are not enough. Grimes's argument depends upon a dubious assumption. Namely, Grimes explicitly assumes that a leak of information from any conspirator is sufficient to expose the conspiracy and render it redundant. Not only is this a mere assumption, it seems to be a false one. There are, in fact, no shortage of leaks, confessions, and quasi-confessions in controversial cases that have not succeeded in overturning official accounts. As mentioned above, E. Howard Hunt, David Morales, and several others have made self-incriminating statements regarding the JFK assassination, and Lloyd Jowers' admitted involvement in Martin Luther King's murder. In the latter case, a jury even found that this was true, and that government agencies were in on the conspiracy. But that has not led to the existence of a conspiracy being accepted by the establishment. Of course, there may be good reasons to doubt those confessions, or quasi-confessions. But to merely assume that the reason existing admissions in controversial cases were not accepted by the establishment is because they were false confessions seems to beg the central question. Recall that even Deep Throat's revelations to Woodward and Bernstein were not in themselves enough to bring down Nixon. If it hadn't been for the White House tape recordings, many of the crimes involved in Watergate may well never have become widely acknowledged. Regarding NSA spying, one of Grimes's own examples, Snowden was not the first person to reveal the kind of thing that was going on. In 2006, AT&T technician Mark Klein alleged that AT&T was cooperating with the NSA to allow the latter access to vast amounts of data. This was reported, and Congress got involved, but ultimately nothing much happened. In addition, NSA employees Thomas Drake and Bill Binney revealed relevant information. Drake alerted Congress and resorted to leaking information to a newspaper reporter only after his efforts to use official channels failed to be effective. He was then prosecuted, one might even say, persecuted. Binney also faced heavy-handed efforts to keep him quiet. Despite some coverage of their situations, their revelations did not turn the massive NSA spying operation into an acknowledged reality. Other than conspiracy theorists, no one, including the mainstream media, paid much attention. As The Guardian belatedly admits, quote, warnings about the dangers of the NSA's surveillance program were largely ignored, unquote. Sweeping the early evidence under the rug wasn't too difficult. Drake and Binney could be muzzled well enough, and otherwise written off as cranks. What made Snowden different is that he provided proof. But that is not at all an easy thing to do, as Snowden's harrowing saga dramatizes. This is, as mentioned above, a reason to think that extrapolating from this case would be of dubious validity. Regarding the Tuskegee experiment, which figures prominently in Grimes's analysis, and is discussed more below, even Peter Buxton, who is credited with exposing the study in 1972, tried repeatedly to expose it before finally finding success. And further, according to Susan Reverby, a group of African American professionals, which included Public Health Service employee Bill Jenkins, also tried to bring attention to the study but were unsuccessful. She writes,
The group wrote an editorial denouncing the study's racism and ethics and sent it to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and then waited for something to happen. Nothing did.
Whether or not a purported conspiracy becomes acknowledged as a genuine conspiracy is not a simple matter of how much time passes before someone talks. It is rather a complex function involving a number of variables, including how carefully compartmentalized the conspiratorial activity is, the vulnerability of the whistleblowers to discreditation, the availability of evidence sufficient to prove the most damning claims, the plausibility of any semi-innocuous fallback position or limited hangout, and also the degree of desperation that exists to quash the story, which may depend on its toxicity and on what financial, political, or ideological interests are at stake. Grimes's study does not in any way address any of these potentially confounding factors. Grimes's characterization of his study is problematic. One of the test cases Grimes considers is labeled vaccination conspiracy. However, Grimes seems to conflate conspiratorial beliefs about vaccination with ill-founded beliefs and with dubious information that is critical of vaccination. This has the effect of suggesting that his analysis of the likelihood of conspiracies to fail has some relevance to critics of vaccination that make no conspiratorial accusations. Many people who raise concerns about vaccination, whether they are well-founded or not, emphasize the published science and argue on that basis for a more cautious approach to vaccination, or else point to specific flaws and limitations in studies supportive of vaccine safety. Contrary to what he suggests, Grimes's analysis is not actually relevant to such challenges to scientific orthodoxy. A scientific consensus can be wrong without any conspiracy to maintain an incorrect view. While Grimes's article does not specifically mention Andrew Wakefield, his category of vaccination conspiracy does include the idea that, quote, there is a link between autism and the MMR vaccine, unquote, which is an idea that is often traced back to Wakefield, who was the first author of a retracted Lancet article that hinted at a possible connection between autism and MMR vaccination. Wakefield has more recently argued that a conspiracy occurred involving CDC scientists, which covered up an association between autism and the timing of MMR vaccination in African American boys. A revealing radio debate was broadcast between Grimes and Wakefield, during which Grimes suggests that his article had established that the conspiracy Wakefield alleged would have involved 25 to 50,000 people. Grimes says,
a CDC/WHO conspiracy would need at least 25 to 50,000 active collaborators. Now you have to insinuate that 25 to 50,000 doctors, researchers, medics, people you meet, people who treat you, are actively conspiring.
To this, Wakefield responds,
it took 5 people to conspire to produce fraudulent data in this case.
That is quite a discrepancy. When challenged to justify his numbers, Grimes stated,
the number of people involved in the CDC/WHO was in a paper I did earlier on this year when I worked out how many people would have to be involved.
This clearly refers to Grimes' 2016. But just as clearly, contrary to Grimes's claim, his paper did nothing to establish the size of the conspiracy alleged. It merely assumed, rather unrealistically, that it must encompass the whole of both institutions. To be fair, Grimes can most plausibly be read as merely suggesting that members of the scientific community would have uncovered and exposed the fraud, had it occurred, not that they would have been involved in the underlying conspiracy itself. Grimes explains that he, quote, assumes all scientists involved would have to be aware of an active cover-up, and that a small group of odious actors would be unable to deceive the scientific community for long timescales, unquote. But it is at best unclear that this assumption would hold in a case like this. If 5 scientists produced a fraudulent study that purported to show that there was no connection between the MMR and autism, a result that nearly everyone in the scientific community both expected and desired, it is not obvious that this would have been easily uncovered by uninvolved scientists. The number of people in position to detect the deception might be quite small, and those people may not be particularly suspicious or eager to find fault. Interestingly, the purported conspiracy that Wakefield and Grimes were arguing about involved an insider, CDC scientist William Thompson, who leaked information in a way that seems to fit Grimes's model. Thompson was even involved in the conspiracy, not just a member of the same institution who stumbled upon it. However, his revelations did not result in the conspiracy theory being accepted as true. This seems to further confirm that it is a mistake to assume that leaks decisively expose conspiracies. Revelations can simply be walked back, contextualized, and/or largely ignored by the mainstream media. When that happens, it is hard to know what to believe. In this case, in a series of recorded telephone conversations, Thompson made several quasi-confessions. He then gave a statement in which he said the collaborators on the study intentionally withheld controversial findings and met to get rid of documents. However, another formal statement released by Thompson seems to moderate his assertions enough to allow an interpretation in which the appropriateness or inappropriateness of what had occurred may be viewed as a matter of reasonable scientific disagreement. Regardless of the underlying truth in this case, the point here is that the genie can sometimes be put back in the bottle. Even if someone talks, we still don't know if they should be believed, or how they should be interpreted. These quite reasonable doubts can be seized upon to nullify or disarm the revelations. Whether or not that is really proper may be hard to adjudicate. These difficulties are, perhaps, typical of what we can expect when there are revelations about most conspiracy theories. Grimes's examples of revealed conspiracies, in contrast, may be quite exceptional. Given that information about the Tuskegee experiment had been published along the way, once the light was shone on it, it was impossible to deny. But most controversial conspiracy theories cannot be assumed to be analogous in this respect. And Snowden's feats, by which he was able to provide dramatic evidence, are difficult, costly, and dangerous to replicate. As for the FBI scandal, let's not forget that Whitehurst first took the matter to his superiors, who did nothing. Then, after he took the matter to the Department of Justice, he was fired, and his credibility was attacked. It was 10 years later that he was finally vindicated, and that was not a foregone conclusion. The Whistleblower Network News calls him, quote, America's first successful FBI whistleblower, unquote. Again, this is not exactly a case that can be assumed to be representative with respect to its ultimate success in becoming an acknowledged fact. Grimes's moral error. Grimes's calculations are explicitly premised on the notion that the Tuskegee experiment was not unethical from its inception, in 1932. Grimes writes,
The study became unethical in the mid-1940s, when penicillin was shown to effectively cure the ailment and yet was not given to the infected men.
This suggests that, prior to penicillin, it was not unethical for doctors to deceive these African American men, to conceal the nature of their disease, and to treat them as subjects rather than as patients, performing experiments on them without their informed consent, rather than providing the standard of care current at the time. Let's not forget that not only were these sharecroppers not informed that they had a terrible and deadly transmissible disease but were actively blocked from finding out. And yet, based on the notion that this was somehow not unethical, Grimes considers the length of time during which the conspiracy was effectively concealed to be 25 years, rather than 40. 25 years being the, quote, time calculated from unethical experiment duration, 1947 to 1972, unquote. In terms of invalidating Grimes's conclusions, this is not nearly the most significant consideration. But it provides a clear way of showing that his study is seriously flawed. While the study seems to be based on objective numbers, this critical number is skewed by an ethical judgment that is at least dubious. And yet there is no indication that the journal editor, peer reviewers of the article, Grimes's social science colleagues who cite the article, or the media outlets that promote its findings raised any objection to this. That is worth repeating. Both scholars and journalists appear to have registered no serious objection to the claim that, for the first 15 years, the Tuskegee study was not unethical. Let's be clear about what Grimes is doing by introducing the issue of when the experiment became unethical. Although it is not possible to enter someone else's mind, it seems he is trying to prove a preconceived idea, namely, that belief in mature conspiracy theories is not rational. His strategy is to use some examples of conspiracies that were revealed as a basis for determining how long it can be expected to take for a conspiracy to be revealed as a function of its size. And for his purpose, it would be helpful if the sampled conspiracies were shorter rather than longer. So, he came up with a reason for shortening the conspiracy associated with the Tuskegee study by implicitly defining the length of the conspiracy as the length of time the study was unethical, and then treating the first 15 years of the study as therefore not part of the period of the conspiracy. But whether or not the Tuskegee study was ethical during those early years is not even the right question. The issue is how long a secret can be held by a fairly large number of people, not whether the secret can be considered, however implausibly, as ethical. Further, different people may have different ideas about what is ethical or right. And, by all appearances, many if not most of the people involved in the study continued to believe it was ethically justified even after penicillin was found to be an effective treatment. The simple proof that Grimes's analysis is invalid. What is the relevance of suggesting that conspiracies tend to fail, or are unlikely to succeed? Surely it is this, to suggest that conspiracy theories are likely to be false, at least mature ones. But being likely to be false, by itself, doesn't imply that a theory should be dismissed. After all, most theories, of all kinds, including scientific theories, are likely to be false. This is where the mathematical analysis comes into play. If Grimes can show the degree of unlikeliness is sufficiently high, a dismissive attitude towards certain conspiracy theories might be warranted. That is what is at stake here. But has Grimes succeeded? By focusing on the Tuskegee study, as in the end Grimes himself does, we can clearly see why the answer must be no, at least for those who accept that the Tuskegee study was unethical and conspiratorial from the beginning. As mentioned above, Grimes claims, quote, "The results of this model suggest that large conspiracies, greater than or equal to 1,000 agents, quickly become untenable and prone to failure," unquote. But the Tuskegee conspiracy lasted about 40 years, from 1932 to 1972. Grimes estimates the number of people in a position to blow the whistle on the study to be 6,700. I've suggested that Grimes's method of estimation is invalid, even a bit silly. Let's nevertheless accept it for the sake of argument. If we do, no valid analysis, mathematical or otherwise, could reasonably support the conclusion that a conspiracy theory involving several thousand conspirators, or less, and which has been around for 4 decades, or less, can be safely dismissed. Once we have a precedent, conspiracies of similar scope must be acknowledged to have the potential to last a similar length of time before exposure. No amount of fancy math can change that, no matter how inventive or obscure. There is one caveat to the idea that a clear precedent can be so powerfully revealing. If something significant has changed since the precedent-setting case, it may no longer have the same implications. However, in this case, the main thing that has changed is that potential conspirators may have learned that they must be more careful, and thus hold their secrets more closely, perhaps by not publishing what they were doing in the scientific literature the whole time. So, although there may have been many people in some way involved in or aware of the Tuskegee experiment, if something similar were attempted today it may well be designed to be handled more discreetly. At least that is a possibility that Grimes has done nothing to refute. Grimes's argument thus fails. This is proven straightforwardly with Grimes's own example and his own assumptions, correcting only his moral error. Indeed, his corrected analysis, if his assumptions had any merit, would give us reasons to believe that large conspiracies actually could succeed for long periods. Conclusion. Grimes purports to offer a mathematical demonstration showing that theories that have been around for a long time that posit large conspiracies are highly likely to have been exposed, if they had been true. But his argument has crippling flaws. It is based on cases that are unlikely to be representative. It depends on a method of approximating the size of conspiracies that is highly unreliable, potentially off by orders of magnitude. It wrongly assumes that leaks by conspirators necessarily lead to the failure of the conspiracy in the sense of mainstream acknowledgement that it was a conspiracy. It ignores the fact that we have no good way of estimating the number of real conspiracies that have never been revealed. And it fudges the length of the Tuskegee experiment, which is the conspiracy upon which Grimes's findings ultimately depend.
You have been listening to a modified portion of an article entitled "Do Conspiracies Tend to Fail?" Philosophical Reflections on a Poorly Supported Academic Meme, which was published in the journal Episteme in 2022 by Kurtis Hagen. This was part 2 of a 2-part podcast sequence based on that article.